powodzi. Mam przyjemność powitać Państwa na wykładzie pierwszym w Polsce profesora Johna Manninga ze Swansea University i myślę, że to, co Pan Profesor nam przedstawi, będzie ogromną inspiracją naukową w naszej dalszej pracy. Professor, we would like to welcome you in our university and we're very happy to have you here.
It's an honor to be here at Medical University. Is that the pronunciation? Good, bravo. That's the only Polish I know. Right, okay, so can you hear me in the back? Yes? Put your hands up. Can you hear me? Yeah? I'm going to talk about this trait, this very, very simple trait in fingers called digit pressure. And we think that this trait captures an event very early in development. In fact, towards the end of the first trimester of pregnancy, between 8 weeks and 12 weeks. And it captures the amount of prenatal sex hormones that we've been exposed to, in particular, the amount of testosterone and the amount of estrogen. And this, I think, relates to a whole range of different things, but today I'm going to talk about disease predispositions. So the trait is actually the length of this finger, index finger. You count fingers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the second finger. Relative to the length of this finger, ring finger, which is the fourth finger. This is why we call it 2D, 4D. So we measure this finger and divide by that finger. Okay? And that gives you the ratio. And in this hand, it's 0.95. So that indicates that this finger, 4D, is longer than 2D. And it's this finger which is sensitive, particularly to testosterone. So we're talking about very early events in development, and in particular, towards the end of the first trimester, between 8 and 12 weeks. And at that point, the male fetus has got testes, and the testes are producing testosterone. So this is the first surge in testosterone that males receive. The second surge occurs just after birth. And the third surge, as we know, we all know about the pubertal surge. So 3 surges, and this is the first one, and it's particularly important. So about 20 years ago now, I suggested that there is a common developmental control between the fingers and the reproductive system. They're kind of tied together. Maybe tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about this. It goes back in evolution to the point where we call that the seed, the pond, many, many, many years ago, many millions of years ago. And our fingers, which are related to our locomotion, are tied in developmentally with the development of our reproductive system. Now, how does this sex difference arise? Well, in the fetus, we have hormonal receptors on the 4th digit. It's packed with hormonal receptors, androgen receptors and estrogen receptors. There are fewer on the 2nd digit. In males, we have this burst of testosterone from the testes and a little bit of estrogen. Okay? So the relative amount of testosterone is high, the relative amount of estrogen is low. And testosterone encourages the growth of this finger, the 4th digit. Estrogen inhibits it. So males end up, if you look at this male, he's got an extreme ratio. Very short index finger, very long ring finger. That tells us that he's had a lot of testosterone before birth relative to what I want to do now is just trot through a few diseases. The first one is prostate cancer. And prostate cancer, we think, is related to long ring fingers. Okay? Lots of testosterone. It's partly dependent on testosterone when we look at older individuals. Can you hear me in the back? You can. Right. But if it's probably more important to look at fetal testosterone than adult levels of testosterone. So there's been a number of studies that have looked at digit ratio in relationship to prostate cancer. Here, the first three have come up with what I think is the real relationship. That in men with long ring fingers, they're more prone to prostate cancer. That fourth study, I was involved in that. Unfortunately, we didn't find an effect. It was in Australia. So we need to do more studies on prostate cancer. What about vascular function? Function of the heart and the vascular system? Well, digit ratio tells us quite a lot about this. The first indication of this is we looked at sports performance and found that if you're a good sportsman, it doesn't matter whether you're a sumo wrestler or a long-distance runner or a surfer, you tend to have a very long ring figure if you're good at that sport. And in relationship to this, it's important to look at the different sports. And one sport in particular, that is long-distance running, is very dependent on the length of the ring finger, the testosterone-dependent finger, if you like. And you can actually predict almost in a race of a large number of runners who's going to come in first, second, third, fourth, and so on. Here is a study I did in Liverpool where we looked at races which were over 4 miles. Here we have men, it's an average finish over 5 races. And these are men with very testosteronized fingers. And this chap, for example, averaged a finish of about, he was second or third or fourth or first or fourth over these 5 races. Whereas this chap here, this one here, he averaged a finish of about, he was 27th, and he's got a very feminized, very short ring finger. That gives us an indication. So here we are. This is where I went down to Los Angeles. It was a terrible chore to do. We got on the beach in Los Angeles, and there was this to interview this big wave surfer who's a world record holder. If you look at his index finger relative to his ring finger, this is a phenomenal ratio. We're talking about much lower than 0.9. So 0.88, something like that. So there's about a centimetre difference in the length of that finger and that one. And it's also important in this trait if you've got a very long ring finger on your right hand and not so long on your left hand. So there's a left-right difference. So many athletes have got very testosteronized right hands and rather feminized left hand. Now, vascular efficiency may feed through to myocardial infarction, heart attack. This is a sample, an early sample of 277 men, and these were men who'd had a heart attack and survived. I tried to measure men who'd had a heart attack and hadn't survived, but I found it very difficult to get ethical permission, so I had to stick with these. So these guys here, these are men with very testosteronized fingers, and they tended to have if they had a heart attack, not everybody has a heart attack, obviously, they tended to be in their late 60s, 70s, whereas these guys with feminized digit ratio tended to have their first heart attack very early in their 40s. Now, that also may be related to biochemistry of men, and in particular, we've recently published this paper on fibrinogen. And men with feminized digit ratios tend to have high levels of fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is a large molecule, and it may have something to do with long-distance running, in the sense that once it gets into the capillaries, it's rather difficult to pump it around the body. So, in our sample, our recently published sample, we find that men with masculinized digit ratios tended to have low fibrinogen, and men with feminized digit ratios tended to have high fibrinogen. There is also a relationship between digit ratio and osteoarthritis, particularly osteoarthritis of the knee rather than the hip. And there's been a number of studies, that one in the UK, this one in the US. Where did I do that? Oh, that was in Australia. This was in Iceland. I think there's one study which didn't find an effect. But basically, if you've got a masculinized digit ratio, you may be heading for osteoarthritis in the knees. Okay. That's not good news, really. Low digit ratio, masculinized digit ratio, is also associated with autism. This was something that I published with Simon Baron Cohen way back in 2001. Honeycutt has done a fairly recent meta-analysis and showed that basically that is the situation, and Barona et al. Has more or less confirmed this. So this is one of the traits that meta-analysis has shown, that digit ratio is a reliable correlate of autism. And you probably know autism is a developmental disorder which is more common in boys than in girls. So it's probably related to high prenatal testosterone. Breast cancer. Here we have this business of right hand and left hand. And the indicator for women with a tendency to breast cancer is long index finger, short ring finger, so lots of estrogen before birth, not so much testosterone. But in the left hand, not in the right hand. And there's been a number of papers which have reported this. That was the first one, which is a small sample, and this, in 2012, this is a very large sample with an Australian cohort. Carpal tunnel syndrome. This is a recently published paper in early human development from this university. And you can see that this is a trait which shows a strong sex difference. And it's more common in females than in males. But in females that show the trait, they tend to have low masculinized digit ratios. So here is a group of patients with an average ratio of 0.99. That's the standard deviation at 0.02. And here is the controls with a higher digit ratio, again the standard deviation 0.02. The difference between those two groups is very large. If you use Cohen's D to look at the effect sizes, that's 1.3 effect size. That's a big difference. So women with carpal tunnel syndrome are masculinized before birth. Now, I point out these standard deviations. If you see standard deviations like that in digit ratio studies, it means that these digit ratio values have been measured properly. Okay? They've been measured very, very accurately by experienced measurers. But you can, if you want to get larger numbers, you can get people to measure their own digits. Okay? So we did this. And you can then do an internet study. So you give people instructions how to measure the figures, and then you calculate digit ratios from there. We did a BBC internet study and ended up with 255,116 participants. So the numbers go from 100 or so up to 250,000. We had more or less the same number of males and females, and we had different ethnic groups, okay, from 187 countries. But the largest number was from the UK and the US. So these are the instructions we give people. If you read them. You see that they're fairly simple instructions, and we presented them with this diagram, showed them where the measurement points were from that point, which is the crease, the base of this finger to the tip, and that point, which is the proximal crease. You often get a bang, I should say, proximal crease to the tip of the finger. That doesn't include all of those phalanges. This phalange here ends about there, and that phalange there ends about there. So it's better to expert hands, but you can't always do that. So here we have the results from that, and again we've got, this is the right hand. We had 117,000 males and 100,000 females. And you can see the males have got a lower digit ratio than the females. But look at the standard deviation. It goes from about 0.02 or 0.03 up to 0.05. Okay? So that's a lot of sloppy measurement. Okay? You can't stand behind 250,000 people and say you're measuring your fingers wrongly. So that's the unfortunate consequence of doing these online studies. But the big plus is that you get a very large sample if you do it through an organisation like British Broadcasting Corporation. Now, okay, so we've got a sex difference in this trait, but the other thing about it is there is quite large ethnic differences. In the BBC study, in the BBC study, here we have the means for white participants, there's males and females. Asian participants, these are from the Indian subcontinent, males, females. From the Middle East, males, females. From China and Japan, again the usual sex difference. And from black participants, males and females. So, in general, we can say that Caucasians have had low testosterone before birth, relatively. And this is something one needs to take into account when you do your studies, so that if you've got a mix of ethnic groups within your sample, you have to control for that in some kind of way. The most testosteronized groups are these two here, these black individuals and these East Asian individuals. Right, okay, so what I want to do now, over the next 10 minutes or so, is to just flip through the BBC Internet study, look at a few health-related questions that we have in there. One of the questions is, how would you describe your health in the last year? On a 7-point Likert scale from I've been very unhealthy to 7, I've been very healthy. This is the distribution of the scores. There weren't all that many people who said that they'd been very unhealthy. Not so many said they'd been very healthy. And there's the mode. Number 6. The mean response, if mean is a relevant statistic in this kind of distribution, it's between 5 and 6. Okay. Well, the first thing we can say about these scores is they're dependent on sex. And so males tended to say, oh yeah, I've been very healthy. That's a mean and the standard error. And these standard error bars are very small because of the size of the sample. 77,000 females. Okay, so there is quite a big sex difference in response to their perception of how healthy they are. There's an ethnic difference in their response as well. Blacks and East Asians tended to give low scores for their health, whereas people from the Middle East and Asians and whites tend to be a bit higher. Age is obviously important in terms of saying how healthy you've been. If you're very old like me, you say, well, you know, it's been pretty old. So you need to partial out the influence of age. So here we've got a multiple regression table with the dependent variable is our health scores, and here we've got the independent variables of age and digit ratio, and p-values are very low here. These are negative relationships, so younger people tended to say that they've been healthy, older people tended to say that they've been unhealthy. But having taken out the effect of age, we're left with still with a significant effect of digit ratio. So if you've got a masculinized digit ratio, you tend to say, well, I've been pretty healthy. That is for males. And we get the same effect for females. Age actually was not significant for females. And here we've got the effect of digit ratio. So females with a masculinized digit ratio tended to robustly say, I've been very healthy over the last So, to kind of conclude on that particular point, self-reported health scores are higher in men than women and show ethnic differences. Low digit ratio is high prenatal testosterone and low prenatal estrogen is associated with high self-reported health scores. What about alcohol and nicotine? There was a question in the BBC study on both of these, nicotine and alcohol, and we had a BBC give us a score from 1 to 6. 1 was never alcohol. 2, rarely. 3, monthly. 4, weekly. 5, 1 day, 1 drink a day. 6, lots of drinks a day. So, on that kind of scale, we collapsed these into 2 groups. So 1 to 4 we took as basically they didn't smoke, they didn't consume alcohol, and 5 to 6 were people who smoked and people who drank alcohol. Now, we got 2 distinct results for smoking and drinking. And basically, people who smoked had feminized digit ratios. And the effect was stronger in females than in males. So that's the mean digit ratio for non-smokers and the mean digit ratio for smokers. It's the same kind of effect in males, but the slope is different. So you get an interaction in the effect. But the effect is independent of sex. So feminized digit ratios are associated with smoking. We found that smoking in general is much more common in young people. And as people got older, they stopped. Alcohol was totally different. And people who drink alcohol, both females and males, have masculinized digit ratio. Okay? And the age effect was rather as well, because although young people did drink quite a lot of alcohol, older people drank even more. So as people get older, they tend to give up smoking and take up alcohol. So if you look, for example, at men, here we have men who don't smoke but drink alcohol. They've got masculinized digit ratios. If you look at men who do smoke and don't drink alcohol, they have feminized digit ratios. Now, these relationships obviously have a link with health, because smoking and alcohol are some of the factors which affect our health. We can look at this a little further, because there are sex differences in digit ratio, there are ethnic differences, there are large racial differences, but there are also national differences. Okay? So in a big study like this, where we have respondents from lots of different countries, we can calculate average digit ratios for the United Kingdom, for the USA, for Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Poland, Bulgaria, Greece, France, and so on. So we were able to do this in terms of numbers for 29 nations, and because the largest group in the study was for whites, we we restricted the analysis to nations where there were predominantly white individuals in those nations. And there's a list. This is a list across, these are means across sex, so that the mean of right digit ratio, the mean of left digit ratio for males and females. Okay, and what I've done is I've just arranged them in descending order, so that, for example, here, Bulgaria, Turkey, Hungary have the highest ratios, and down here, New Zealand, Iceland, Portugal, Australia have the lowest digit ratios. These are means of white individuals in these nations within the state. So that's just another way of looking at them. So I put a few names on here. Up here is Bulgaria, Turkey, Hungary. There's Poland, USA, UK is about the middle. Down here is New Zealand, Australia, Iceland, Portugal. You can take these means and look at national characteristics. And so nations with average digit ratios which are masculinized tend to have high GDP, gross per capita production. So we have a negative relationship for GDP. Okay? So this may be that these nations here are masculinized, they're assertive, they're aggressive, and this is the kind of way that they organize their commerce and so on. And these nations are a little bit more relaxed, less assertive, a little less aggressive, which is actually a pretty good thing as well, isn't it? What about their cigarette consumption? Well, as one would expect, nations with feminized digit ratios smoke more cigarettes. Nations with masculinized digit ratio smoke less in the way of cigarettes. There are probably disease implications here. So this is looking at bladder cancer, and this is daily. So a way of looking at mortality and disability, so the number of years lost due to mortality and disability for bladder cancer. So here we have this scale of increasing impact of bladder cancer per nation. And these are the average digit ratios per nation. And you can see that there is a greater impact of bladder cancer for feminized nations rather than masculinized nations. But you've got to partial out some of the variables here. So you need to partial out GDP, and you need to partial out cigarette consumption. If you do that in a multiple regression, you still end up with digit ratio being per nation being predictive of the impact of bladder cancer, and GDP and cigarette consumption becomes non-significant. You can look at other things, and there are a large number of significant relationships with various cancers in these data, and various diseases. And this is looking at dailies for nephritis and nephrosis. And again, we've got a positive relationship, which is significant. And so that nations with feminized digit ratios tend to have higher impact of nephritis and nephrosis. But when you remove the effect of GDP and cigarette consumption, you lose that expect this if cigarette consumption follows the same kind of pattern, which it does. Okay? So nations that have feminized digit ratios, they smoke more and they have more lung cancer. And that looks to be a fairly reasonable kind of link. However, when I took the effect of GDP and the effect of the amount of cigarette smoking out of the equation, then I just lost the significance. I wasn't very happy about that, but there we are. So it's just gone above the formal level of significance of 0.05. So I don't know about that. Lung cancer is something which I'm very interested in terms of relationships with digit ratio. Okay, so just to recap some of the things I've been talking about. Individuals with low 2D40, which is high prenatal testosterone, low prenatal estrogen, tend to report better health than individuals with high digit ratio. That's not to say that they have better health, it's just that that's how they approach life in general. Okay? Smoking is associated with high 2D40, and the tendency to drink alcohol is linked to low 2D40. I should say that in Germany, in Langen, there is a group who've looked at this link with alcohol and taken it much further. They've looked at people who are addicted to alcohol rather than just, have the odd beer or wine and so on. And people who are addicted to alcohol have got very masculinized digit ratios. So I think that relationship is a very real one. National mean digit ratio correlates positively with cigarette consumption and the impact on health for nephritis, bladder and lung cancer. High 2D40 may be a biomarker for susceptibility to bladder and lung cancer. Let's do the studies. Because taking mean digit ratios across nations and looking for correlations is not the best way of looking at these kind of diseases. Let's do the studies, look at the individuals, look at patients, look at the controls, and see if there are differences in digit ratio. High 2D40 is linked to heart disease in men. There's been a number of studies now that shows that is the case. High left side 2D40 may be associated with susceptibility to breast cancer. Low 2D40 may be associated with prostate cancer. What I should have said there is associated with autism. So we've got an array of diseases or developmental disorders which are linked to digit ratio. And if you've got a masculinized digit ratio, it's good news for some of them and bad news for others. If you've got a feminized digit ratio, it's good news for some of them and bad news for others. So eventually something will get us, we'll die of something. But digit ratio may tell us a little bit about the etiology. Why are some people susceptible to certain things and other people are in some way protected against certain things? Okay. Thank you very much for listening.